Before I was an Elden Ring challenge runner, I was a Super Mario World challenge runner. Now, it's very possible that you've never heard of this kind of thing before, but it's called Kaizo Mario. And even though it was originally the title of one of the first and most popular, brutally difficult Super Mario World ROM hacks ever created, the name has since been adapted by the community to represent this style of Super Mario World ROM hacks. These games have a lot in common with one of the core reasons I love Soulsborne so much, that sweet feeling of success after struggling to win for so long. Let's fucking go! Oh my god. The feeling of an earned victory is strong both in my favorite Kaizo Mario games and in my hardest Elden Ring challenge runs. I love both of these things, and I thought to myself, what if I combined two of my favorite things to make one disgusting monstrosity? So on this episode of Clown Cosplay Adventures, we're finally gonna learn where Mario ends up after he falls into one of his game's bottomless pits. And it's not pretty. I hate to ruin the illusion for you so early, but the mod I'm using here is purely cosmetic. After all, I couldn't do a Mario run in good conscience without looking the part. Anyway, this run is going to be a little bit different from my usual fare. In my previous runs, I did the entire game with a strict set of rules and an incredibly limited toolset. But Mario, throughout all of his outings, has utilized and mastered many different weapons and tools and attacks to accomplish his goals. So what better way to pretend to be Mario than to take as many attacks as I can from those games and try to find something resembling them here in Elden Ring. And, to make things even harder on myself, I'm gonna steal from Bushy's bag of tricks and add the limitation that I can only use each attack for one mainline boss. For example, if I use Mario's ground pound to beat Margit, then I can't use that move anymore to defeat any of the other mainline bosses in the game. Any boss outside of the strictly required path, such as optional bosses that I need to kill for a specific attack or item, or anything else in between, can be accomplished with any weapon, used or not. I may win a challenge, but I'm also not willing to spend my whole life on this, you get me? Oh, and one more little thing that I almost completely forgot to mention. It's one thing to look the part, but you've also got to feel the part. Even though I'll be using attacks from nearly every generation of Mario's storied history, my one true Mario love is on the Super Nintendo, the home of this bone-shaped controller. To really take this challenge to the next level, I gotta play Elden Ring the same way that I play Kaizo Mario. Except, I don't use this controller, I personally use this one. That's right, I use a hitbox-style fight pad to play Super Mario World ROM hacks. Look, it's a long story. Luckily, this thing has more buttons than a SNES controller, but still tragically less than a normal controller. So we're going to be riding the struggle bus with this run. The buttons on the left are my movement, and the buttons on the right are my 4 face buttons plus my 4 trigger buttons. There are buttons on the sides that map to start and select so I can access the map and pause menu, and a couple more that are graciously mapped to L3 and R3 so I can crouch and lock on. This controller has almost everything I need to play, albeit uncomfortably, but most importantly, it's missing analog sticks. I bound my left buttons from the D-pad to directional movement using Steam's tools, but that means I'm missing a D-pad, which means I can't scroll through my items or navigate a menu. Luckily, Steam has some incredible controller features that allows me to add modes to it, and without wasting too much time on explaining what's happening, I'm able to swap the left buttons from the analog stick to the D-pad just by pressing start, which may or may not get me into trouble later. And finally, I needed a quick way to scroll through my consumables, so I made my Y button, or triangle button for you DualShock users, scroll through my items using a slightly longer press. It may be extremely jank and sometimes makes me look like I've never used a controller before in my life, but hey, it gets the job done, eventually. Did I need to go through all of this effort for a challenge run? No. Do I regret it? Yeah, I do. Even though I'm showing you some controller cam now, I didn't bother recording my controller for the rest of the run, so you're gonna have to take my word for it. Not that it's too difficult to see the results of this controller though. The lock-on button, as well as a couple of others, are placed very inconveniently for quick access, which means my targeting is going to look very messy. And a lack of analog sticks means that we're basically playing in Super Mario 64 mode, where the camera is going to be a really nasty enemy for some of this run's encounters, so look forward to that. And to top things off, not that it really matters all that much, but I've got 8-directional movement instead of analog, resulting in some really choppy looking and imprecise movement. I'm sure all of these things won't conspire to give me an absolutely horrible time. It's a tale as old as time. Start a challenge run and get stuck doing chores for the next half hour. We're all used to this part by now, collecting seeds and tears and medallions, so I won't waste much time here. What I will say though is that it definitely gave me some much needed practice using this nightmare of a control scheme, which honestly helped a lot with my confidence before even attempting to take on Margit. And speaking of Margit, after all these challenge runs that I've done of Elden Ring, it's gotten to the point where I can comfortably sit on Margit. He's a bit of a wall, but he still is the first real boss of just about any run, so it makes sense that he'll go down pretty easily in most scenarios. So, to honor that fact, the ability that I want to use to take him down is the classic ground pound that Mario uses in so many of his games. I was able to pick this up from the Mistwood and Limgrave and easily slot it into my hammer. Speaking of my hammer, I'm going to be using it as a vessel for most of the Arts of War that I'll be using in this run, but it won't count as using the hammer itself for those fights. So even though I'm using the hammer as a vessel for ground pound against Margit, I'll still be able to choose to use the hammer for another boss in the future. Just wanted to throw that out there to avoid any confusion. Anyway, the ground pound is slow and pretty dangerous to use, so I thought that if it were able to succeed against any boss, it would be the first one, and honestly, the first attempt went way better than I expected. I actually almost won here, and even though I could probably have taken Margit out in the next attempt or two, I decided to put him off for another round of chores. I went through Limgrave tunnels for more upgrade materials, which went... yeah. Honestly, the bosses wound up being easier than most of the normal enemies in this run, since I usually only have to worry about one target at a time, but hey, what are you gonna do? Next, I took care of most of my Liurnia chores, and because I know I'll need it later, I went into the Raya Lucaria Crystal Tunnel to collect the first Smithing Stone Bell Bearing. I was slightly worried about fighting this Crystallian, but my fears were wiped away pretty quickly as I pummeled this thing into dust with Mario's hammer. I then asked the local weapon hammerer to hammer my shiny new rocks into my slightly less shiny hammer, and before heading back to Margit, I figured that it'd be a good idea to take a quick detour to Castle Morn on the Weeping Peninsula to pay a little visit to a man who, unfortunately, hasn't been paying his coin tax and needs to be made an example of. Really though, this trip was just to prepare for a future encounter, and with that out of the way, it's finally time to visit Margit again. Margit has a surprising amount of openings for something even as slow as Ground Slam, but most times I attacked, I ended up getting hit back. That's the main reason that I wanted to do this fight with this attack, because I knew it would be much less dangerous to trade blows with the likes of Margit than it would be against someone like Malakath. I also learned that with this ground pound attack in particular, I need to be extra careful to make sure that I'm actually facing my target when I hit the button, or I'll just fling myself in the wrong direction. That happened more times than I'd care to admit. I'm able to pull out the victory in the end, but I wound up trading blows so many times that I had no flasks left by the time the fight was over. I even ran out of blue flasks, but that's partly because I'm still really clumsy with this controller at this point and accidentally drank 2 at a time. Oh well, now that Margit has canonically eaten... Now that Margit has canonically eaten Mario's ass, it's time to move on. We're not going to waste much time here because the next boss is just on the other side of this castle, but that's not going to stop Mario from committing a crime against the lower class though, and stealing this poor man's bell bearing by pummeling him into a fine powder. This crime was necessary though, because it allows us to buy the cestus for later. Why? Don't worry about that yet, my sweet summer child, because I'm bringing back another crime. Remember when Mario murdered that poor man in Castle Morn and stole his spear? Yeah, well that's going to be the next attack that we use on this next boss, the spin attack. Mario's spin attack comes in quite a few flavors over his mini-games. In Super Mario World, he can use it to bounce off of things that would otherwise kill him. In Super Mario Galaxy, it's one of his main damaging moves. And I guess it's in Super Mario Odyssey as well. It doesn't matter which game you choose for this representation, it's a bit of a stretch to call this Mario's spin attack. But hey, this is the best I could do given the parameters and circumstances of this challenge, so if you think you have a better attack for this one, feel free to yell at me in the comments below, I guess. Anyway, this spear comes hot off the presses at a shiny +8, so I don't feel the need to waste any of my precious upgrade materials to power it up. In spite of the lack of further upgrades though, this spin attack winds up shredding Godric to bits pretty easily. Godric gives plenty of wide openings, and the transition to Phase 2 gives Mario a huge opportunity to bully, especially when combined with a very convenient poise break. Next, we're gonna head into Hogwarts for the crossover of the century. But before that, there's a few things that I want to collect, while hopefully gaining enough runes along the way for a slick level boost. First, I visit one of the jails in Limgrave to fight a Crucible Knight. I've never really been good at fighting these, even with a normal controller, and I'm probably just a bit underpowered for this fight at this moment, so I ended up struggling for 15 minutes here until I get my prize. We won't use it anytime soon, but I just wanted to get it while the getting was, nearby, I guess. Next up is a visit to Bernal's shack for the Kick Art of War, which is the next Mario attack on the list. Mario's kicked a number of things in his career, mostly shells and 2D games, but most notably, as an attack, Mario kicks a lot of his enemies in the face in Super Mario 64. It's much more powerful in that game than it is in this game though. Not eager to get my own face kicked in quite yet, I go find more upgrade stones and do my Altus Plateau chores and power up just a little bit more before finally moving on to fight the mascot of Hogwarts, the Red Wolf of Radagon. This doesn't go very well. The Kick Art of War is pretty famously terrible, being incredibly weak and pretty dang slow to boot. Get it? Of course, that's why I chose to use it against the boss with the smallest health pool, but unfortunately for me, this same boss is also pretty darn fast. There's a couple of good openings to exploit, but I'm not great at this fight and I die. Twice. I thought that I prepared well, but I guess I just underestimated this dog a little bit. So I go find more stones and even farm them from the tunnel workers for a while so I can get my hammer to a comfortable +16 for more powerful kicks. It's enough to go from 18 damage per kick to 25, but I'm still not quite up to the task just yet. The attempts went better, but I still got overwhelmed. So it's time to exhaust the last of the easy-to-find stone upgrades and net some runes along the way. There are 3 Falling Star Beasts to kill between Altus Plateau and Caelid, and they each add to my collection of Smithing Stone 6s and 7s. The beast on top of Mount Gelmir was especially difficult, but with its help I'm able to push my hammer to +20 and myself to rune level 40. I also go collect the Blessed Dew Talisman since this fight takes so long, and I have an empty talisman slot, and some cracked tears for my physic. And with all of that finally done, I head back to the wolf and I completely forgot to hit record in my capture software before killing it first try this time around. Look, I know my holding of this hammer is kind of suspicious, but you're just gonna have to trust me on this one. I kicked the wolf to death, okay? Here's a little simulation of how it looked. Man, it always hurts to realize that you've forgotten to record something important, but oh well, whatever. No more mistakes like that for the rest of this run. Promise. But that's the Red Wolf and Mario's Kick both put out to pasture while we make way for bigger and better things. And with that, it's time to move forward to the next stage of Mario's evolution. With the doggy turned into a fine paste beneath Mario's blue-collar boot, it's time to move on to the one reason anyone with a foot fetish is even still playing this game and watching these videos. For this fight, we're going to pull from one of Mario's newest games, Super Mario Odyssey. One of the quickest ways to move around in that game is by rolling around like an absolute idiot. I mean, to be fair, he wasn't the first to pioneer this unique mode of transportation, but he certainly was one of the most recent. Also, it's not exactly an attack in that game per se, but hey, just work with me here. I'm doing the best I can with what I've got, okay? Anyway, you probably already know where this one is going. When I did my Altus chores, one of the things I went out of my way to grab was the Lightning Ram Art of War from this beetle that thinks it's a goat. I wasn't really sure how this fight was going to play out. I was convinced that this fight was going to be way harder than kicking a dog to death, or that I was going to run out of FP really quickly. But would you just look at how much damage this thing does? I was shook.
I am shooketh.
So yeah, much to my own surprise, Renala was dead on the first attempt with the funny goat meme attack, and without any real trouble either. Both phases were down much quicker than I ever expected, making me wonder if I should have saved this attack for later. But oh well, what's done is done, and the timing couldn't be any more perfect because the next few attacks on Mario's list require a bit of a cheeky respec to a magic build. So I dumped most of my stats into intelligence to make Mario officially the smartest he's ever been, and so I don't have to bother too much with those pesky upgrades, I grabbed the meteorite staff as my weapon of choice for this stretch. And speaking of stretches, this next attack is quite a big one. But you know how in Super Mario Galaxy you can use the Wiimote to shoot star bits? Well, yeah, that's what this is. Glintstone Pebble, which is kind of neat since glintstone sorceries are literally the magic that's derived from the stars. This spell is nice and quick, extremely cheap to cast, and hits decently hard with the stats I have, so it was a solid choice to use to combat the Draconic Tree Sentinel with as surprisingly fast as this boss can be. Yeah, it may have taken me 6 tries, but I was totally right, you know. After beating the first 2 bosses with 2 of the first attacks that I could think of, I actually sat down and planned out the rest of the run and which attacks that I might want to use against which bosses. The order ends up being extremely important too, because I want to use these attacks in an order such that I have to respect the least amount of times to make it to the end of the game. It was like a puzzle, trying to fit every piece into the slots where they belong and make the most sense. And even though I think some other attacks may have made more sense for this boss, what I'm really limited by here is the few respecs that I have available to me in a playthrough. Anyway, even with this super fast Glintstone Pebble, the Draconic Tree Sentinel was as difficult an encounter as it ever was, but in the end it was no match for the power of the stars. Before moving on to the next boss, I decided to take a bit of a detour to the gates of Leyndell's outer wall to visit a couple more sentinels. This fight was a major pain in the nose, specifically this jerk with the shield. Occasionally, even with as fast as my spell is, this dude will just reflect my pebble back at me. Super rude. Eventually though, I got into a groove and took it down, along with its much easier and much simpler partner. This gives me the Erdtree Great Shield, which will come into play quite a bit later. A few extra fun bucks are in store for those of you who can correctly guess which of Mario's abilities that one is going to be. Next up though is the star of both Super Mario Sunshine and Halo, the Flood. There's a shockingly low amount of water-based magic in this game, which is very sad, but what we do have is the Oracle Bubbles. I did a whole challenge run with this spell as one of the 2 main stars of the show, so I think it's safe to say that, yeah, I kinda know what I'm doing. Hey, we're gonna cut that out, right? There's a few things in Elden Ring that'll always be funny to me, and Poise breaking literally any boss with the power of bubbles is one of them. This poor golden ghost didn't know what hit him, and before too long, he finally realizes how washed he truly is, and lets me win. Unfortunately, that's all the magic-based abilities that I could justify for a Mario run. Just the 2. Yeah, I know, pretty sad. But that's a big reason why I was happy to use the meteorite staff and its inability to be upgraded. It's just simpler that way. Anyway, it's back to Renala for another respec, but this time we're gonna pump our faith and spend a ton of our newly acquired runes on making this simple talisman as strong as possible. Next, I go on a wild goose chase to make Brother Corrin want to go hang out with Gold Mask, and once he's finally there, I can purchase Mario's next attack, Discus of Light. This attack, by another stretch of our imagination, is the infallible and indomitable Hattie from Super Mario Odyssey. I may not be able to control enemies with it, and I'm not able to bounce off of it, but it's pretty dang good at hitting foes from a distance and spinning like crazy as it does its job. So that's good enough for me. So it's Morgott versus Hattie in a battle for the ages. Who will win? Oh, Morgott, of course. So this attack is extremely silly. It casts relatively quickly, but it takes almost 0 FP to cast and can be chained a few times before running out of stamina or being forced to move. So while I don't have any real risk of running out of blue for this fight, I do have a risk of being tuckered out because the damage this spell does is much lower than I anticipated. There's an occasional opportunity for a single cast to do double damage as the discus hits Morgott a second time on its way back, but at 125 damage per hit, it's turned into somewhat of an endurance challenge this time around. Nothing nearly as bad as the Briar armor, but it's still tiring in its own right. As is usually the case with Morgott, I took a lot of random stray hits from a combination of impatience and rustiness, but finally on the 6th attempt, I got this run. Oh no! No! No!
My soul is in so much pain.
Yeah, I rolled just a little bit early against this attack and got one-tapped with a magic pixel. You hate to see it. Luckily though, it only took one more attempt to put the Omen King down for good, but man, those magic pixel deaths are always extremely painful. With Morgott defeated, you've got to know who's next, and if you don't, I have to ask, hey, how are you? You doing good? I hope so, you deserve it. Anyway, it's off to the mountains for a date with the giant. With access to the mountain, it's time to do the usual traveling and chores. This is the same as it's ever been, and there's nothing really exciting about it, so I'll skip over the drudgery and go ahead and introduce you to the big man himself, the Fire Giant. Now, when you think of Mario and the attacks that he comes equipped with, one of the first things that comes to mind is probably his trusty Fireball. He's had access to this power in almost every single Mario game, and it just wouldn't be a Mario video without it, would it? And yeah, I really thought that using the Fireball against the Fire Giant would be good, maybe even easy. Funny, even. Yeah, that didn't go well at all. To be completely fair to Flamesling, I do think that mechanically it would be able to do the job, but mathematically, because of how much FP this spell costs, it just doesn't pan out. Even if I were good enough at the game to not get clipped here and there by the occasional Fire Giant slap, I'd still run out of blue far before getting the job done. And that's not even taking into account how absurdly difficult it would be to get any damage with this spell on Fire Giant's Phase 2, which would cost more FP per damage on average due to the difficulty of landing a shot. Not that I got a chance to test it, but, you know, theory and stuff. So after the 4th attempt, even though I planned this out ahead of time, I decided to pivot. Clearly, Mario's Fireball was a poor choice to use against the Fire Giant. Who knew? Maybe it would be better served against Malekith. Sure, Malekith might be a lot faster, but his openings are pretty big and his health pool is like that of a gnat's compared to this guy's. But while staying in the faith stat requirement, what am I able to use? Remember a long time ago, way before even beating Renala, when Mario killed the Crucible Knight in cold blood? Well, that fight rewarded me with a very specific spell that requires faith. Aspect of the Crucible, Tail. This is taking the place of the Tanuki suit from Super Mario Bros. 3. This one doesn't even require your imagination. Sure, I can't fly, but look, he spins in the Mario game, he spins here. Perfect reflection. The cost to damage ratio for this spell is way better than the Fireball's at the cost of being quite slow with a pretty short range. I can choose to make it even slower too, granting an extra tail swipe per cast. That means more damage for everybody! Including me. Perhaps the toughest aspect of fighting the Fire Giant, especially in lower damage runs, is the arena itself. This boss is pretty notorious for running away at inopportune times, which would be annoying in any scenario, but is especially bad since the arena here is filled with all manner of cliffs and rocks and trees. Occasionally, the big man will find himself on the other side of a weirdly placed tree stump or behind a slightly raised platform. When that happens and I can't reposition quickly enough, the target lock on the giant's gigantic foot is lost. In any other run, with any normal controller, that's nothing but a minor annoyance. But with this monstrosity, getting the target lock back is a challenge by itself. It's also pretty annoying in any run when the giant lands on top of this particular rock in the middle of the arena, but like everything else, it's even worse in this run due to the controller and my choice of weapon. The Fire Giant has openings that are wide enough to, most of the time at least, get 2 beefy tail swipes in safely. But to do that, I have to begin casting almost immediately when the opportunity presents itself. Having to reposition myself precariously atop this slightly elevated stone usually just means that I'm not attacking for a while. There's a lot that gets in the way of this fight being a smooth one, not least of which is my dangerously low rune level. Not only is my spell not hitting quite as hard as it could, but I'm also getting one-tapped by many of the giant's attacks, including the attempts with the fireball. It was 2.5 straight hours of... yeah, not exactly ideal. So what else could I do but go and visit Vare and kill Magnus to be granted passage to Mogwin Palace for a great sad boy sacrifice. Approximately 1 hour and a couple hundred deaths later, not mine of course, and I'm now sitting around a comfortable rune level 85 and ready to go back to work. And the first attempt back, I'm hit with another harsh reality of using this ridiculous controller. It's really difficult to get on my horse quickly in this challenge. I was doing so well too, and despite how many rune levels I gained, I just keep dying. Sometimes in funny ways, sometimes in sad ways, and finally, I get this run.
It's done. Mamma mia, that was way too difficult.
Way too difficult indeed. I didn't expect the fire giant to give me so much trouble this time around, but here we are. I'll chalk it up to a devastating combination of impatience and a scuffed controller situation, but alas, it's finally done and we can move on to better bosses. Wait, what's that? Who's next? Ah, fuck! So, remember that detour I took a little bit earlier to take out the pair of tree sentinels outside of Leyndell? Yeah, it was all for this moment. Unfortunately, I couldn't quite fit a faith power in here, so I have to respec back to strength temporarily, just so Mario can equip his iconic cape. It requires a lot of strength after all. This power originally debuted in Super Mario World, but the power I'm using is more of a Super Smash Bros. Original that allows Mario to reflect projectiles back at his attackers. The perfect ability to take on a pair of obnoxious zoners, right? In my Shield Hero video, I used this shield to take out this same boss, so I thought it would be pretty easy. But what I didn't account for was that during that challenge, I had the ability to attack like a normal freaking human being when it makes sense to. I don't have that luxury here. It's all reflect all the time. I hope you get real used to this noise, because you'll be hearing it a lot. Well, not you, me. Because we won't spend the full hour talking that it took for me to take these guys down using this method. No, I get it. It's surprising that it took so long for me to kill this boss in this way, but as is customary for the most beloved boss in Elden Ring, I found myself falling victim to a wide array of frustrating scenarios, overlapping fireballs, Sonic Side B, and the ever-present threat of one twin throwing a fireball while the other one closes in, making it entirely too unsafe to dare to reflect it back. On top of all of that is just a pile of boring old execution mistakes. Aside from all of that, there's nothing really interesting about this fight. It's just the normal Godskin duo jank that I fear every time I deign to do one of these challenge runs. But hey, with the giant and his loose scabs wiped off the face of the lands between, we can respec back to Faith and move on to the tail end of the game where the fun can start again in earnest. The fire giant proved to be way too hardy for a piddly fireball to whittle away its health in a reasonable amount of time and FP, so when I made the decision to use the Tanuki tail in its place, I did so knowing that the decision would ultimately pit me up against Malekith with the very same fireball. Truthfully, it's probably better this way, but I did originally plan this fight with the tail. As far as endgame bosses go though, Malekith has a shockingly low health pull to make up for his surprising speed. And despite his high speed, it's not so ludicrous as to make it impossible for the slowest attacks to defeat him, including my piddly fireball. Plus, I have extreme confidence in my ability to exploit Phase 1 of this fight to its utmost, given how much I was able to master it during my Briar Armor run. And I was right. Aside from one or two hilarious false starts, pretty much every death in this fight was due to Phase 2. I've never been particularly great at fighting Malekith as it is, and having such a slow, short-range, non-homing projectile that doesn't do a whole hell of a lot of damage as my only attack only makes things much more difficult for me. To make matters worse, I've gotten rusty during my time away from the game and forgot how to dodge some attacks that didn't really give me much trouble before. And on top of everything else, remember how at the beginning of the video I mentioned that I have separate modes on this controller for navigating menus and navigating the world? Well, that mode change happens when I hit the start button, but you know what else uses the start button? Skipping cinematics. So if I'm hitting the start button as fast as possible to skip the cinematic to transition into Phase 2, then that means I'm spamming the D-pad instead of using my analog stick in Phase 2 if I pressed the start button an odd number of times. I died at least 2 or 3 times this way in this fight, just wasting an entire run for nothing. So it may or may not surprise you to hear that it took me more time to beat Malekith than it took me to beat the Godskin duo, and you know what? I'm just gonna go ahead and blame the controller on that one. All in all, it took me about an hour and 40 minutes to defeat him, but it very nearly only took an hour and 10 minutes because of this run. Look, I said it once in my shield video, and I said it again in my rolling video, and I'll say it one more time in this video. Malekith has some stanky hitboxes. I mean, yeah, you could totally argue that I had no business casting a spell in this moment, and I died because I got greedy, which is true, but in this instance, I totally believe that my greed should have paid off quite handsomely here. The fireball practically goes through Malekith's spine in this clip, just so he can murder me. That's not very beneficent of him if you ask me. Aside from that heartbreaking death, most of my deaths happened for one of 3 reasons. Either I got greedy, I got blindsided by an attack I wasn't expecting him to do in this context, such as the time he went ranged mode while running after me after recovering from ranged mode, or, most often, I got hit by things that I really should know how to dodge by now. Hey, it happens to us all. Anyway, it only took 4 more runs to cook this mutt for good after that death to Malekith's magic pixel. One of which was yet another magic pixel. You hate to see it. With Malekith defeated, we wake up in the land where all of the worst Super Mario Maker levels go to die, and make our way to the next boss. I take a quick detour to grab the Ice Spear Art of War from this knight's cavalry, and slot it into the spear I got way earlier in the run to face Gideon with, and then respec back to strength one last time to finish out the game. This ice spear is meant to be the ice flower power from Super Mario Galaxy and other games. Yeah, it's a bit of a stretch, but just roll with it. Gideon's quite a dodgy fella in his old age, but I've done enough ranged-only runs to know how this one goes. Just bait and punish, or just normal punish. He made me work for it, but Gideon was down on the first attempt without too much trouble. I didn't think Gideon would be very difficult considering the weapon I took in to defeat him, but what did worry me was the next boss. Hoaraloo is a boss that always gives me some anxiety going into him, especially considering I decided to use Mario's punches from Super Mario 64 as my one and only weapon for this fight. The first phase can be dangerous, but is ultimately pretty easy to exploit into a loop where you can pummel him endlessly. It's Phase 2 that really scares me though, because he becomes much quicker with some devastating command grabs and more than a few awkward animations. But despite the fact that I've started these fights with Hoaraloo in many of these challenge runs, with the expectation that he's going to be a massive brick wall for me and my progress, for many of these runs I've somehow managed to defeat him on the first try. I was convinced that this run would be different, that choosing to fight Hoaraloo with my fists, the very way that he intends to fight me, would end in disaster and heartbreak, and I was wrong. Somehow I managed to win on the first try again with nothing but the Cestus. Much easier than I thought, especially considering the fact that Cestus only is a challenge run that exists. Hoaraloo is done, which means there's only 2 bosses remaining. Those of you who have been paying attention may realize that I've been holding on to this hammer for the entire game, and haven't actually used it for any of the main bosses, which means that it's still available for me to use against Radagon, which I will, gladly. There's a lot of games you can pull this hammer from Super Mario RPG to the original Donkey Kong, but no matter what game you choose, it won't make this hammer any less effective against the penultimate boss of Elden Ring. And as suspected, the Radman himself was no match for Mario's iconic hammer. I mean, heck, I've beaten this boss with much worse attacks before, so this is practically easy mode. The real problem at this point was finding enough moves in Elden Ring that could reasonably tie back to one of Mario's moves from one of his many games. And if I could have found more interesting attacks and used them instead of, I don't know, the kick or the cape, I totally would have. But I also figured that it'd be a good idea to reward myself with a quick endgame by saving some of the easier and more potent weapons till the end. So if Radagon was defeated with the hammer, what did I save for the Elden Beast? Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to the biggest stretch of the imagination that exists in this entire video of imagination-stretching false equivalences. This is Yoshi's tongue. Look, I know what you're thinking. Mario would never murder Yoshi and use its tongue as a surprisingly potent beating stick. And to you I say, have you ever watched a Kaizo Mario stream in your life? A Yoshi's entire existence is predicated on its ability to die for Mario's well-being. So no, I disagree with your assertion that Mario is some saintly benefactor for Yoshi kind. Just because a few dozen Yoshis happen to save Mario's life as a baby, doesn't mean that Mario is required to respond in kind. Oh, no. Mario has traveled the lands between, felled half a dozen demigods, and slain the outer god watching over this realm, and now sits upon his rightful throne as king, without Yoshi. What does Yoshi even do? Mamma mia, thanks for watching this unhinged challenge run. I'm gonna be real honest with you, this one took a lot out of me to make. Not because it was soul-crushingly difficult like the Briar Armor run, or because it literally took a lot of creative development work like my modded custom perfumer run, but mostly because I think I'm done with these kinds of challenge run videos. After over a year of working on these, my heart really isn't in it anymore, which I began to realize as I continued to procrastinate on making this video. I had this run started and planned out all the way back in January, when I could have reasonably released it ahead of March 10th, also known as Mario Day, and even before the Mario movie came out. Sometimes procrastination just hits really hard, y'all. So, while I am done with Elden Ring challenge runs for the time being, I do intend to return for the DLC, whenever that comes out. But in the meantime, I'll be exploring some other video formats that I really hope you all stick around for. YouTube has a habit of burying my content randomly, so if you want to see whatever weird thing I have coming up, be sure to hit that bell or join the Discord server. I know most of you watching are just here for the Elden Ring content, and I get it, but I hope that at least some of you have stuck around not just because of my determination and skill, but because of my presentation style and my insights. I have a lot more of that on this channel outside of Elden Ring content, and it would mean a lot to me if you work through some of my backlog and watch some of my lesser known videos. I have Metroidvania reviews, a Doom 2016 no-jump challenge run, a deep dive on copyright and fair use as it pertains to fan games, and so much more that I pour so much of myself into. So please go give those a watch if you haven't already. It's at least a few hours of quality content that could use a bit more love, and I just know you're looking for another hour or two to burn. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching and joining me on this challenge run adventure. It's meant a lot to me and has helped me through one of the more difficult times of my life in more ways than one, and I'm extremely grateful for all of it. Sappy stuff aside, it's time to move on, so I'll see you next time.